This video is designed to provide a comprehensive guide on how to mat your artwork. Here is a timestamp list of every component I will be covering. This way you can quickly reference a topic that you found useful during the presentation or skip parts you don't need. A mat is simply the border an artist places around their finished artwork for displaying purposes. It is important to learn how to do this correctly, as it is not only a means used for presenting your students' artwork, but it is often a requirement for most competitions and district events. And believe me, if you have the prettiest piece of artwork at a show and it's displayed in a sloppy mat, people will notice. So make sure you're giving this task the effort it deserves. The link provided below titled District Matting Standards are the standards by which all of the artwork submitted to the district events should be presented. However, other events such as Vase, Scholastic, and Rodeo all have their own standards. And while the district standards are more than likely going to be in alignment with the standards of any competition in which you're participating, you always need to check the event website, as those standards are subject to change. It will also provide you with important information like how wide your mat needs to be, maximum dimensions of artwork, formatting of information on the back of the artwork, and a multitude of other things you'll need to know in order to properly mat your students' artwork. Here's the list of consumables you will use for matting your artwork. Please note that we are using masking tape, not painter's tape. Painter's tape has a weaker grip than masking tape, and it will make the work prone to coming loose, so please avoid it. In addition, you will need a mat cutter, a ruler or a yardstick, and a pencil. First and foremost, make sure that you speak to your team lead or the finance office about who your approved vendors are, and then bookmark their websites on your browser. Today I'm using Saks, Dick Blick, and the District Warehouse. The links for these will be provided below the video, but be sure to ask your team members who their preferred vendors are. Also, make sure you're comparing prices between the vendors. Matboard can get super expensive, and prices fluctuate throughout the year. It only takes a few extra seconds, and it will save you a ton of money. There are lots of types of matboard, but I prefer smooth black, white core crescent board. It provides contrast against the exposed white core when you bevel your cut, but this is a matter of preference. Just make sure you ask your team what they use so that all of your work is presented cohesively. For tape, just order whatever is cheapest. I typically order 1-inch and 1.5-inch masking tape because I use it for both affixing the work to the mat and attaching the backing. Just note that this method is not archival, as the masking tape is not acid-free. That means it can come loose or damage the artwork if it stays on for a very long period of time. It will work fine for our purposes. Just let your students know that if they plan to have the artwork framed, or if they're going to store it for a long time, that they need to remove the artwork from the mat beforehand. Measuring your work and getting the proper dimensions is where you're most likely to make your mistakes, so this is where you really need to make sure that you're organized. The first thing we'll need to do is measure the dimensions of the image. Notice that I did not say that we are measuring the dimensions of the paper, and that is an important distinction. This measurement we are taking is going to give us the dimension of the window or the inside cut of our mat. I would recommend that you have all of your students make a 1-inch border around their paper before starting every project. That will make this process much easier. If not, some of their image will have to be cropped or you will have to mount it. That extra inch around the edge will save you a lot of hassle when it comes time to mat. Okay, so I have my project that I'm going to measure here, and I'm also putting down a post-it that I can write down my measurements on. The width of my image is 19 3/4 inches, and my height is 25 inches. The math on the right-hand side here is illustrating what I'm writing down on my post-it. For my example, I'm going to be making a 2-inch mat, which is pretty standard. And to help you visualize it, I will just draw one around my image and label it. Now, to figure out the outside length, I can just add up the parts. The image height is 25 inches, then I have 2 inches on the top and 2 inches on the bottom that I need to add. And I'll need to do the same for the width. The image is 19 3/4 inches wide, and I have 2 inches on each side for the mat. When I add it all up, I get 23 3/4 inches by 29 inches. Now I have both dimensions and I'm ready to start cutting. Your mat cutter has very few moving parts and really only does two things. It makes straight cuts and it makes beveled cuts. The model on my campus has 2 separate cutters, each of which is just a housing for a blade that is held either straight up and down or at an angle. The cutter is what determines whether your cut will be straight or beveled. The cutter rests in the rail arm, which is what guides the cutter to make straight cuts. This is also the part that holds your mat in place. There are also two guides. This one is adjustable. It rests in two U-channels and is used to set the width of your mat. This one at the bottom is called the squaring arm, which works with the other guide to keep your mat square while you're making your cuts. Finally, this is a slip sheet. A slip sheet is simply a piece of matboard that you place under your cutting material when you make a cut. The idea behind this is, since your cuts are done upside down, and the blade penetrates the front of the matboard from behind, it prevents frayed edges and gives cleaner cuts as your blade starts to dull. I actually don't use slip sheets, and I'll explain why in the next portion of the video, but this is again preference. Before you even get started, make sure your blades are sharp, and you will know if they are not. If you start making a cut and the blade is stuttering a lot, stop what you're doing and replace the blade. In my entire career, I have filled out one injury-related report, and it's because I flayed my finger when I tried to force a dull blade through matboard. All because I was too lazy to change the blade. It wasn't worth it, it didn't save me time, and it will actually start to tear the matboard after a while. And this is why I don't use a slip sheet. So instead of trying to get clean cuts with a dull blade, just change the blade. So the first thing I'll do is cut the outside dimension of my board, which is 23 3/4 inches by 29 inches. I personally measure the matboard using the same yardstick I use to measure the image. That way I know there will be no discrepancies in my measurements. The mat cutter actually does have units of measurement along the square arm, but the rulers on these are almost always off. So if you want to play it safe, use the same measurement tool throughout the entire process. Once I have my dimensions marked, I'm going to remove the guides so it doesn't get in my way, then place my matboard under the rail arm. Next, I'll line up my mark with the edge of my rail arm, making sure it's flush against my squaring arm. Finally, I will use my straight cutter to make my cut. Then I will rotate the paper to make my second cut, and I should be left with a piece of matboard the size of my largest measurement. Also notice that I am making my measurement marks and my cuts with the matboard facing down. All of the cuts I make will be face down like this to prevent the cutter from making marks when I run it along the board. Before I cut the window out, I need to first measure my 2-inch border. And to do that, I'm going to make myself a template out of some scrap. This will just be a 2-inch strip of matboard that I will use to trace some guidelines on the back of my matboard. I will also use this to set the guide on my mat cutter. I'll do this by loosening the knobs on the guide, then I will place the matboard against the guide and the squaring arm and adjust it until my measurement mark is lined up with the edge of the rail. Once I know it's lined up, I can tighten the knobs on my guide and make my cut. Now I have a 2-inch template that I can trace, and my guide is set to 2 inches. Now to get my window dimensions, I don't need to measure at all. I can just line up my template and use it to trace a 2-inch border on all 4 sides. And just a reminder, you should be doing this on the back of your matboard. If I did all the steps correctly up to this point, then this rectangle I now have in the center should match the dimensions I have written on my post-it for my window dimensions, which is 19 3/4 inches by 25 inches. Just use your ruler to make sure this is correct before you make any cuts. To make my cut, I'll first make sure that my board is fit snug against both the guide and the square arm so I know it's square. For this cut, we will be using the bevel cutter, and there should be a mark on the cutter to indicate where the blade will make contact with the paper. Some cutters are marked with green and red so you know where to start and stop. This one just has a line. They're all a little different, but there should be something to indicate where your cut will start. Notice that I placed mine just above the corner of my window, and I'm going to bring it down just past the opposite corner. The reason I'm going slightly further is because if I'm too short, I will end up with a frayed corner. I will rotate the board and repeat those steps 3 more times. The simplest way to do this is just sort of eyeball it. I start by taping the top and bottom of the work from the back. I personally like to avoid corners because, again, this is not archival and I have to assume that the piece will be removed from the mat at some point. It has been my experience that corners are more prone to damage, so I leave an inch or two of space. Now I turn the artwork over, line up my mat, and apply pressure to the top and bottom to set the tape. Finally, I can flip the piece over and tape down the left and right side. If you're worried about removing tape because there is no border on the work or the work is done on sensitive material, you can put the tape on your shirt or pants before you use it to tape the piece. The idea is that the lint on your clothes will weaken the adhesive slightly and make the tape more easy to remove. You could measure here, but there's no real need to be precise. I take a piece of poster board and line it up on the back with about an inch of space left on each side. Then, I mark about 1 inch in on the two sides that overlap and cut it with a paper cutter. I should end up with a piece of poster board that has dimensions roughly 2 inches smaller than my mat. Finally, I attach it with masking tape. As previously mentioned, you can follow the guidelines in the district matting standards document provided in the link below by writing your school name, your name, and client ISD on the back. However, make sure you check regulations for additional information and formatting if you are matting for a competition. You may need to include the student's name, title of the artwork, and some competitions require an attached cover sheet. For my last tip, make sure you order your supplies well in advance and budget a lot of time for this before your event. It's not uncommon to have 25 pieces of work or more going to any given event, and by the time you mat, label, and cover your work, you're looking at a few hours of stuff to do.